Today I'm going to show you what's inside of the Audi V8 engine and how it works. Now this engine is here because it's through timing chain codes, just like all Audis, no surprise. However, what's interesting about this engine is that I've actually got it mounted backwards here. This is actually the front of the engine, which would face the front of the vehicle. The radiator would be up here. The crankshaft pulley will be over here. That means on the back, here's where your clutch would mount up to, and of course the transmission over on this side. And I've done that because the timing chains are unfortunately located on the back side of this engine, which makes it difficult to service, as you'll see. Now taking a look around this engine, you can see we've got plastic valve covers, aluminum heads, and an aluminum block. Over here we have our oil filter. Coming around the front here, this is where the AC compressor and water pump would be located. You also notice that this engine has a 90-degree V as opposed to a typical 60-degree V6. The first thing I'm going to do is pull off these valve covers. Taking a look under the valve cover, things are actually pretty clean in here. It looks like this engine did have its share of oil changes. Now this is a 5-valve engine, which means that there's 2 lobes here that feed a roller rocker arm system to 3 valves on the intake side, and 1 lobe over here that feeds the roller rocker arm to open the 2 exhaust valves. Pry off these little rubber things here. I'm sure these cause oil leaks. Next up, I'm just going to rip off the valve cover on the passenger side. And once again, things look pretty similar to the driver's side. I'm just going to remove the coolant crossover tube here. Right, next up I'm going to remove this rear timing cover here that sits on the head. Alright, now we're going to pop this cover off. And they say you can service this in the car, but I have no idea how you'd access this bolt from underneath with the big transmission mounted here and the Cadillac converter. So now I'm going to remove this cover. Alright, now we can pop off that cover. Alright, now you can see part of the timing setup. We're going to remove this oil filter housing out of the way. You'll notice it's half bolted to the block and half bolted to the timing cover, so that's why I want to get it out of the way. And pull off, whoa, the oil filter hasn't got a bit of oil inside. Oh shoot, I gotta get something to fill that up. So I got my baby daughter's old sleeper here. I'm just going to sap that up. And one of her old short sleeve ones. I just used that to sap up the oil. I got one of her hats too. I'm sure she wouldn't mind. I see a bunch of hex bolts, so I'm going to start with those, and then there's a bunch of T30s going all the way around. Now it's time for the Torx. Alright, let's see if we've left any bolts behind. And then we'll pull off this timing cover here. Oh, more oil. And what a marvel of engineering. Here we have the Audi V8's timing chain set up here. We first start here at the crankshaft, where we have the main timing chain over here that's going to power these 2 intermediary gears. As you can see, it has its own guides over here, and this one here is the tensioner for this chain. Now those 2 intermediary gears are then going to power the double overhead camshafts on this side and over on this side. You can see this one's got its tensioner over here, and this one's got a tensioner over here. All of these tensioners so far seem to be okay. Now with that out of the way, we have this big J-shaped thing over here. It's got a timing chain tensioner over here. It's powered by the crankshaft as well, with this timing chain that leads over to this intermediary gear over here. Now this gear is just going to be driving these other 2 gears over here to drive accessories. So the bottom one here is for the power steering pump, and this one here is for the water pump and the AC compressor. Honestly, just the way that everything's been packaged makes it look very complicated, but essentially it's just the accessory drives up front and then the cam drives at the back. Of course, timing this thing is going to be a little bit challenging, but all you really have to do is time the cam gears. Accessory drives don't really need to be timed. The only loose components I've found so far is this tensioner over here, and the fact that I can move this slide in and out, but I think that's normal. I'm just going to start zipping off everything so we can get this timing chain setup out of the way. As you can see, this is the tensioner. It's just a spring-loaded one. I'm surprised there's no ratcheting mechanism. Get this other guide off here. The guides don't look broken. I'm going to just pull off this chain. Nice thick chain, unlike a lot of other dual overhead cam engines. Similarly on this side here. Alright, we'll just take this guy off here. Here's your variable valve timing gear. Here's the chain from this side. And this is the variable valve timing actuator and its little mechanism over here. Got a little gasket here for the oil supply. Over on this side, same thing. Off the actuator. Here's the actuator. And a little gasket. Go over here, let's see if we can pull some more timing components. Let's pop off this guy here. Doesn't look broken. This chain over here. Let's get the cam drive off here. Chain tensioner looks okay. Again, these are hydraulically powered. Guides don't look broken or anything like that. Interesting. Oh, we got a broken plastic guide here. Check that out. You can see this is the cause of the engine's failure. We got a broken plastic guide here. And we'll pop off this gear here. This gear set. This one kind of looks like an oil pump. Let's investigate a little further. So that's actually just a flange to mount the gear on. There's no pump on the inside. Now over here on the driver's side, here you can see the power steering pump. And that was bolted to the back side of this gear over here. Alright, down at the bottom here, got a couple more Torx and hexes. Alright, now we're going to remove this accessory drive over here. Alright, got one gear at the bottom there. Next up we're going to turn to removing this exhaust manifold. I think it's pretty cool how they put a bolt on the outside here. How's that for airflow? Alright, next up I'm going to move to the top of the head here. We're going to zip off all of these cam cap bolts. Okay, I'm going to have to crack these loose first. Well, I broke my bit, so that'll probably be it for today. Alright, another day, and 2 socket sets later, I got another T30 here. I'm going to try this out. I'm going to break them by hand this time. Oh, don't tell me this is going to break. Dude, what did they torque these to? Look, it's twisted already. So I got everything loose except for one that was damaged. I'm going to zip the rest of them off. Now I can pop off these cam caps. I don't see too much wear on these cam caps. You can take off the intake camshaft. Now looking at the camshaft itself, once again we just got minor lines here. Nothing too bad or worn down. The main issue with this engine was that timing. Can't really take off the exhaust side with this strip bolt, but luckily Audi has put a hole in here so that I can access the head bolt through here. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen off all these head bolts. These are an M10 triple square. I had to go out and buy a socket specifically for this engine. Now I'm going to run these off. Right, now I'm going to go in and lift off the engine head. And we'll take off the head gasket. This is cool, it's pretty stiff. And it's a multi-steel layer design here. Taking a look inside this engine, I noticed that everything here is actually pretty clean. These are one of the cleanest pistons I've found inside of a used engine. I can definitely tell this engine's had its fair share of good oil changes with quality oil. It's just too bad they couldn't take care of all these oil leaks on the outside. Pretty much going to do the same thing on the passenger side here. We're going to knock off the exhaust manifold first. Interesting design with a really long nut. It goes right through it. Now I can remove the manifold. I've already cracked these cam caps loose. I'm just going to zip them off. Alright, taking a look at the cam caps here. They're not really that worn out. A couple of lines inside of it. Not too bad overall. Pull off the exhaust camshaft here. Just a couple of lines, not really too worn out over here. And the intake camshaft. Again, this one's not too worn out. Just a little bit of lines, but pretty good shape. Now I'm going to remove the head bolts. Alright, now we're going to run these bolts out. Alright, now I'm going to remove this head. Taking a look at the engine over on this side, things are looking again pretty clean. Don't notice any damage or too much carbon buildup. This engine was pretty well maintained internally at least. Here we are in the middle of the V-bank of the engine with the heads removed. This here is your positive crankcase ventilation controller. Here we have the 2 knock sensors on either side. They're held on by 13s. I like though that they have extra wiring that goes to underneath here because the wiring that's near the engine is most likely to become brittle, so you replace this all in one piece. Alright, next up we have a bunch of T30s again to go all the way around for this top plate. Okay, after chasing hidden bolts, I won't find any more, so I'm just going to have to pry it off. Okay, well that's a part of the PCV system there. Alright, under all this sludge I found a hidden bolt over here. Finally I can pop off this PCV baffle here. And we have this gasket thing underneath here with holes in it and a little bit of crust. So just before we turn the engine over, I got this engine mount bracket in the way here. Just knock that out. Gonna remove this hose from here. Oil cooler is bolted on with some Torx. And here's the oil cooler. Of course there's oil spilling out everywhere. I don't know why Audi made this ledge here. Looks kind of weird. Alright, now I'm going to turn this engine over. Probably make a huge mess here. My wife's not going to want me to touch the baby anytime soon with the smell. Looks like the previous owner already dropped the oil pan to see if there's any carnage. And we'll pull up that oil pan. Here you can see what's inside. You can see the drain plug on these are actually a magnet. Here you can see the oil level sensor. Now back in those days, Audi wanted to be all fancy and do away without adding a dipstick. So instead they made it electronic, so you have to check it from within the car's scan tool. Other things I noticed here, there's some baffles that are tacked on here. The oil pan itself is a stamped steel design, but I do notice a bit of sludge inside of here. So despite this engine being well maintained, looks like something's been sitting here that should not be in here. Taking a look underneath the oil pan, you can see things are again very well maintained, very clean inside. There's no tarnishing. This engine had really good oil inside. The oil pickup tube is nice and clean. There's no sludge in there at least. This is the oil pickup area. It sucks up oil, and you can see it's going to draw in over here and draw into the oil pump. We do also have a oil crossover tube over here. As to why it's shaped like this, I can't really see why. It's not like there's too much extra things along the side here that need to be encapsulated in oil. They should have just shaped it like a regular traditional oil pan that goes longitudinal. I'm going to start by removing this oil pickup filter here. So there's your oil pickup filter. Got quite a bit of weight to it. Continuing along, got a couple more Torx over here that go to this tube to the oil pump. So a very unique design here. We have the timing chain drive, and it's got this little accessory shaft that leads into the oil pump over here. So I'm going to somehow have to get that shaft to come off from this pump over here. So here's how that works. It creates suction here. Alright, so I'm learning just as you are. I already took off the pulley from here, and now I find that if I loosen this, I can get the oil pump shaft off. And this is also the accessory drive shaft, so that's how that works. It's all timing chain powered. I'm going to remove the oil pump now. It's not just an oil pump now. Don't tell me this is some balancer assembly or something. I don't know why you need a balancer on a V8. Now, this entire upper oil pan is held on by a bunch of triple square M8s. I don't know why they changed the fastener. Everything else came apart with a Torx 30. Alright, now I can pop off this upper oil pan. Alright, looks like it's time for diapers. So with the oil pan off, you can see that we have a couple of oil passages that go further down into the block. Now this block actually splits into two. We have the lower half over here, and then of course we have the upper half here. Here we have a plastic baffle at the bottom here to point the oil down towards the bottom of the oil pan. It's held in by a bunch of T30s. And we'll just pop that off. Here's what I don't get. The Audi engine, most of it came off with Torx T30. Then the upper oil pan came off with triple squares. Now I see we've got E-Torx for the main cap bolts, and then the other half of the block here comes off with hex. Why do you use so many different types of fasteners? Just use hexes like normal Japanese engines. Alright, so the main cap bolts here are an E14. I'm going to go ahead and loosen these off. Alright, now we're going to zip these bolts off here. Once those E-Torx are loose, I'm trying to remove the bottom part of this block here. It's held on by a bunch of 5mm hex. We go all the way around here. Whoa, it's heavy. Alright, so here we've got an E-Torx 12 socket. This is for the connecting rod caps. Now we're going to run these bolts off here. Alright, now I'm going to remove some of these connecting rod caps here. The coating is wore out on some of them here. Alright, now I'm going to start popping these pistons down. Oh, that's clean. I get this crankshaft out of here. Alright, now that the block is all clear, I'm going to take it off the engine stand. Hopefully it's not too heavy. Okay, not bad because it's aluminum. So I've got everything removed from the engine. Let's take a closer look at how it works. Now we'll start by looking at the lubrication system, starting at the bottom of the engine here. Here you can see you have that stamped steel oil pan with the oil level sensor and this interesting looking pickup tube, so to speak. It's got this little filter on it which is going to directly feed the oil pump over here. Now the oil pump itself is driven off of that accessory shaft that comes off the timing side of the engine up at the front. You can see there's a bunch of gears underneath this cover here. If I pop this off, you can see there's a bunch of gears up at the front here. I'm going to zip off a bunch of these E-Torx here so we can see what this looks like. Pop this cover off. Some parts went flying there. So taking a look inside of this pump here, you can see you've got gears inside here, and that's going to create fluid flow as this rotates here. So here we've got 3 gears, a driven one, an auxiliary one, which I have no idea what it does, and then this other one over here. So these are going to spin in the opposite direction, pushing the fluid from the inlet up here to the outlet over here. The spring that's sat here, as well as this little valve here, is what acts as your oil pressure gauge. Oil pump is then going to send its oil down through this hole over here on the upper part of the oil pan. It's then going to send it to the lower part of the block, located through this little hole over here. Also to note, there was that crossover tube over here, and that correlates to these two holes over here on the lower part of the block. Now while we're on the upper oil pan, you can see we've also got connections here and over here for the oil cooler on the side of the block. Now oil from that upper oil pan is going to be sent straight to the side of the block over here where this oil cooler mounts up to. That's going to cool the oil, and then it'll be sent back through this hole over here, through that crossover tube, and back out to this side of the block. Now this lower part of the block here is pretty hefty, even though it's made of aluminum. And rightfully so, because it has to carry all of the main bearings inside of here and the main cap bolts that bolt the crankshaft to the block. That way, having this ladder frame design is going to make it nice and strong, especially that this engine produces 300 plus horsepower. Not too much to say about this crankshaft other than the fact that it's got 5 main bearings, just like a 4-cylinder engine. The connecting rod bearings share a journal on each side, and condition wise you can see this engine was pretty clean on the inside. I gotta say, some of the main bearings in the block were not perfect. They do have a little bit of scoring on them. Alright, and here we come to the main portion, which is the block here. Now that oil from the upper part of the block is going to be sent up through this gallery over here, and it's going to be sent to this hole. Now if you remember, this is the piece here that sat on top of the engine, which I broke because I missed a bolt, but this has a big giant gallery inside of here, which is going to take that oil and send it all the way over here to the back where the oil filter lives. I really don't like this design because you're depending on yet another interface over here to seal all that oil pressure. Now taking a look at the oil filter design, this is everyone's favorite because they think it's easy to change, being situated right at the top of the engine. This one actually sits near the back because the timing side of the engine is at the back of the engine, and these like to crack a lot because of the heat and over torquing them. Now once that oil is nice and filtered out, it's then going to be sent down through these main oil galleys down the middle of the engine, running the length of the block. Again, you're depending on many sealing interfaces over here just for that oil, and it's just more opportunity for leaks to occur. As you can tell, this engine is no short of leaks. There's just oil everywhere inside of this engine. Looking inside the valley, you can see there's actually a few ports over here that bring oil up to the head over here that tap into that center gallery. And of course, looking from the bottom here, the main bearings are also going to tap into that galley over there. We've also got oil sprayers inside of here that's going to spray the cylinder walls with oil as it's moving up and down for good lubrication. And of course, don't forget the back part of the engine here where all of the timing chain components are located. Now this block is a semi-closed deck design, which means that the entire area around the pistons over here are not open for coolant to flow. In fact, they're reinforced in the middle here, and that's better for strength. As for cooling though, they opened up these little ports over here that are drilled across so you can get coolant flowing in between these pistons for effective cooling. Head gasket is a multi-layer steel, and boy is it a hefty design. This interface also has to seal against oil because that's going to take oil up to the heads. Now taking a look at the pistons, they do feel fairly hefty. Now this is the one that was gummed up the most and had a lot of carbon on it. I wonder if maybe one of the valve stem seals were leaking, causing oil to drop down, and this one to burn a lot of oil. All of the other pistons look really clean, like the rest of the engine that seems well maintained. Looking at the compression rings, they seem actually kind of oversized and pretty springy. The oil control ring, which is this one over here, is also pretty springy. It's got a little spring on the inside that allows oil to flow through. Now from this point over here, it doesn't seem like there's much space for oil to flow through, so I wouldn't be surprised if this engine design starts to burn oil at higher mileage. That's also another reason why these newer engines are calling for much thinner synthetic oil. Now taking a look under the cylinder head here, you'll first notice that there's actually a 5-valve design. There's 3 valves on the intake and 2 on the exhaust. That's going to allow more air to come in and potentially give you more power. Other things here include the coolant passages around the head here to cool things like the exhaust valves. I noticed that they are pretty crusty and they got a lot of stuff built up on them. Here you can also see the oil gallery that goes up to lubricate the head from the block. This is what the head bolt looks like. You can see there's an extra set of threads over here. I actually wonder if it threads into the head as it's threading into the block. That'll be pretty interesting. Taking a look in the head here, you can see the roller arm system. Here you have 2 lobes that act on one roller arm itself, and that's going to act on the 3 separate valve springs over here. However, on the exhaust side, we have 1 roller that's going to act on both of these valve springs. Now oil from the bottom is then going to come up to an oil galley that runs on the intake side as well as one on the exhaust side of the block. And if you see here in the cam bearings, they're actually bored down to collect oil from that in order to lubricate them. It's a little sad though that despite how many oil changes this engine had, you will still have a little bit of wear on these cam bearings. Nothing is really perfect. Check out how the intake port is really clean. You could definitely see where the exhaust from the port injection cleaned out the back of those valves. Now at the back of the engine here, you can see more oil journals here that would sit inside of here, and that would feed the variable valve timing system with oil. Taking a quick look at the variable valve timing system here. Remember, this bolted up to the back of the engine here. This is the variable valve timing solenoid. It's going to take some oil pressure. Now some of it's going to go to the chain tensioner. Now the rest of that oil pressure is going to be controlled over here and sent out through these couple of holes over here on the front. Now those holes are going to be bolted up to these holes over here on the variable valve timing gear together, and as you send oil pressure to it, that's going to control the phase of this by adjusting the angle between the input and the output. And that's how you have variable valve timing on the intake side only for this engine. Alright, let's get to the real reason why these engines are an absolute failure, and that's because of the timing chains. As you saw earlier, the timing chain setup is absolutely complex. Like, why do you need all of these timing chain slides and guides and 4 different timing chains just to drive a dual overhead cam engine? It's absolutely ridiculous and overcomplicated for no reason. Now, while most people think timing chains are better than belts, these do have their set of failures because you have so many different tensioners in there for so many different chains. You can obviously lose oil pressure, which is going to make those skip. The chains themselves can stretch over time. Moreover, you have these weak little plastic pieces in here that could break, which was the case in this engine. So here's the main reason why this engine is here, and that's because of this piece of plastic called a timing chain guide. It's made of PA66 plastic. Over time, with heat cycling and the bad materials that they've used here, you can see here there's actually a piece where it's been chewed out already by the timing chain once it's broken and probably slipped. Previous owner was getting timing chain related codes, so they just decided to swap the engine completely rather than deal with a mess of this job. Alright, so great, maybe your timing chain slide broke and you want to change it. Well, in a normal car you'd pull off the front end and do-act the timing system. Maybe in a day you're back on the road. But in this engine, the most stupidest thing is that they put the timing chain setup at the back of the engine, and there's not much at the front of the engine. The engine bay is very compact, and you have to remove the transmission in order to access this timing side of the engine, which also means that you have to drop the engine out of the car in order to access it. Now, given the complexity of this as well as the amount of labor involved, most of these cars just end up in the junkyard, or they end up with a motor swap, and then some guy like me will buy it and make a video about it. Moreover, they made things even more complex by adding this accessory chain drive in front of it, so that it drives the AC compressor, power steering pump, and the oil pump through those accessory shafts that we saw earlier. I don't really see a need for that when you could have just run those off of simple belts like the alternator is. So here's just something cool I found. Those really long nuts that come off of the exhaust manifold over here run right through the manifold so that it can bolt the flange directly to the head. However, it doesn't really bother the airflow because there's actually chambers inside of here. You have 4 cylinders, but there's 3 separate chambers inside of here that bolt up to the catalytic converter. I just think that's pretty cool. Remember, the next time you see an Audi on the dealership lot for really cheap, think of all these little components that could fail and the labor associated with it before committing to it. Overall, I think the Audi 4.2 V8 engine is actually pretty cool to see from an engineering perspective. The Germans just have a different way of creating an engine, and it's pretty interesting from a design and manufacturing perspective. Although this one did have its share of oil changes, stuff like this is still going to happen because of the nature of the components and the design. Make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one.